Well, we're off to a much faster start. We're off to a much faster start on book two. We're actually meeting again less than 3 months later, and look to be on track
That's
to
right.
finish it this calendar year. But volume two, which is studies in theological style, clerical styles, and the next one is going to be lay styles. Uh, but we did Saint Irenaeus last time, the anti-Gnostic, which is interesting because there's that he's obviously not Gnostic, but his recovery of the word no, he's a lowercase g supporter of gnosis,
Right.
and not versus the capital G Gnosticism as a heresy. But now we're on to Augustine, who is started out you could call Manichaeism what he was before Christian a Gnostic faith,
That's right.
and
Yep.
that's and and he's obviously the foundation of so much, along with Aquinas, the greatest Christian philosopher. Uh, to my knowledge, I'd say the greatest African philosopher. Uh, but I think we all kind of knew before we read it that he is not going to be an Augustinian.
Right.
Uh,
Right, because Balthasar was a Jesuit right before leaving to become a diocesan priest. So,
not just that, but intellectually, he is not, because you have that sort of Neoplatonic element that may be
right,
a
sure.
holdover from his Manichaeism. That is, you think of Augustine as really the one who really brought Plato into Christian philosophy and theology. And we've kind of talked so many times that he's not anti-Platonic, but he is defiantly not Platonic in a way that when you Plato so foundational is very, very obvious. And so was here to see how you would deal with him. I wonder initially if for Balthasar he might be like Heidegger in the sense of like, I don't know who's a Heideggerian, even if you weren't a Nazi, who would be a Heideggerian, but everybody admires him as a philosopher, as a human being. He was trash. Uh, and as a poet, he was also trash. So that's less important. Everyone, we love and respect Heidegger's thoughts and ideas, and he brought so much. And if no one is really going to be a Heideggerian existentialist. But he's still not Augustine, but he came at Augustine from a really weird angle, a very interesting angle, a way of incorporating him. Did you see some of that too?
Yeah, I mean, what I was looking forward to this chapter because, again, unlike Balthasar, right, probably the biggest influence in my life theologically, the closest thing you could say I have to a patron saint is Augustine. When I was discerning religious life, I very nearly joined a community that um, follows the role of Saint Augustine. So I was interested in his presentation. But again, he's continuing, it seems like, this idea of seeing, right, and how Augustine initially saw things through his sort of Manichaean / pagan view, but then he shifted. He saw things differently. Again, you that formulation of like kind of a philosophy or theology that is gazing upward. So in some ways, it's almost like Balthasar was kind of doing a presentation of like the education of Saint Augustine as a kind of outside source. And again, I want to offer a general commentary on the title of this selection. Again, I had limited familiarity with Balthasar, but I had assumed, based on the title, that this was going to be a liturgical book, clerical styles, right? So you immediately think of like behaviors of particular priests or how they say mass. Very, and so on. But that's not this
Something
at
more
all.
like Guardini's Spirit of the Liturgy, or Pope Benedict slash Cardinal Ratzinger, is
Exactly.
similarly titled about liturgy, about the practice, liturgical practice. But yeah, it's
Right.
not. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So this is again a fairly straightforward presentation of various great theologians, right? So this is so that's been interesting. I guess I wasn't expecting that.
And theologians as philosophers, and I've always felt that the line between theologian and philosopher is, far murkier than maybe pure philosophers tend to give
Right,
credit to. Even within that, he is definitely looking at them as uh, people doing Christian philosophy.
right,
It is a philosophically grounded and philosophically minded examination of these books.
right, right. And Balthasar, I think, says as much later on in the chapter. He refers to uh, again that there really isn't this binary between theology and philosophy. They complement each other. In fact, philosophy points to theology. I think he makes that argument at the very end.
And he does well. He opens up really by kind of making his pitch for his Augustine.
Right.
And you mentioned saying this is I was searching for where I highlighted, of course, this in the very first page, page 95 of my edition, on the chapter of Augustine, the second full paragraph. Seeing, wanting to see, and being able to see are for Augustine the essence of knowledge, just as he places the sense of sight high above the others. So the act of seeing spiritually becomes for him the act of cognition, pure and simple, which, based on the early stuff, was seeing so attached to his idea of aesthetics. So I'm going to say that for Balthasar, to some extent, it is a limitation on his part that he sees aesthetics almost purely from a visual point of view. The metaphors are visual, and when it comes to actual, you know, empirical practice, he does really focus on sight as opposed to any other senses. But no one has, this is the very beginning, actually, the first paragraph. No one has praised God so assiduously as a supreme beauty, or attempted so consistently to capture the true and the good with the category of aesthetics as Augustine in the period during and after his conversion. So, I mean, again, that, the true and the good are only understandable through aesthetics, and say through beauty, that formulation, the true, the good, and the beautiful. I was I went back to review some of the stuff before we met, and sort of start at the beginning. The very first sentence: Augustine's path, which we call his conversion, which comprises many stages. Like, what is we going to call it? Is there another term for this? I felt like he picked up, Chekhov's gun here, and it never got anything with it. It was like, so if this is not a conversion, what is? He does say it's like this uh turning from, well, we were talking kind of off cam before. You kind of spoke about this, that this looking down to looking up, lower aesthetics to higher aesthetics is what Balthasar calls it. But I still think of, like, why we can call it a conversion. We don't have to like hedge it.
Right. Yeah. And again, like we have to wonder, is this an issue of translation? But even if it weren't, right? I mean, you and I are both or move in the world of academe in a lot of ways, and sometimes academics say things like this. It's like um just say what you
Mhm.
mean. Like we don't need to add all this different terminologies and
You're not two
you know
words away from making the word count for the paper.
right.
It's just like, I really, that's why I wrote the note above there. Like, is there another term? And I don't think your movement from lower to higher aesthetics is, honestly, I would still call it a conversion. It's just that the path of conversion was aesthetic, and it does hold up with the confessions. That is, you know, pick up and read, and being um, struck by the words, and not necessarily by logos, but by words, which I would argue is an aesthetic experience, the interaction with literature. But he doesn't really go into that. But I do buy uh, that, and obviously he's read more of Augusta than I have. I've read, City of God and the Confessions and nothing else. And he brings in mostly things that aren't that. I felt a little left behind.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the great ironies that, even though Augustine is somebody I consider, the closest thing to a patron saint, I too have read the Confessions. I've read that multiple times. I have not finished City of God, uh, but I read like maybe 300 pages of it or something. Um, and then, other than some scattered sermons and like bits of the Rule of Saint Augustine, like that's it. So I was immediately intrigued on some of these other texts, particularly the True Religion. But I want to point
Which he
everybody
calls his central work
right.
on page 97. That and De Libero Arbitrio. Uh, is that free will? On free will, I think.
Um,
Uh, if translated from the Latin. If there's a
yeah,
Latin scholar out there, my daughter might actually know. She knows some Latin.
yeah. I
But
mean,
anyway,
Libero's
the true
definitely
religion,
yeah.
I'm guessing free will, which is obviously, Augustine free will is its own thing.
Um, yeah. So I want to point everybody to 96. This was very interesting. So he says there's disagreement about when Augustine's questing reason saw its all-important sight at the time of his turning from Manichaeism and skepticism to the overwhelming light of Plotinus into philosophical training for its ecstatic contemplation, or not until later, when the clear turning from philosophy to Christian theology took place. It's a particular formulation there, turning from philosophy to Christian theology. I think in some ways you can make the comparison to the way he's phrasing it there. You know, um, with Saint Paul, obviously a deeply trained Pharisee, right? Um, encounters the risen Christ and makes the kind of shift that's needed while keeping everything else that he already has, his education. So Augustine already has this kind of grounding, right? And as he begins to embrace Christianity. Balthasar seems to point out to us that Plotinus gives him the necessary architecture, to fully see and grasp certain things like the forms and beauty and such. So I thought it was very interesting. I don't think I've seen that kind of presentation.
I wonder, like, did he write? Do we have any writings before his conversion, if we can call it that? Because he. It's interesting, journey that I am not familiar with, or being described that way. That he does posit that you brought up there, from you know his pre-Christian days, Manichaeanism, uh, it's going to only live Plotinus, and to philosophical training, and then the turning from philosophy to Christian theology. We really think of that move from Manichaeism to Christianity. That like he posits sort of an interregnum where he was primarily a philosopher or primarily thinking philosophically.
Yes, and what I also appreciated about this is how it's like kind of building on that point here. It demonstrates how the presentation of Augustine in the popular imagination, namely that he was this wild man who at some point encountered, the faith of his youth and turned around. That is not true. We don't have any evidence of that, obviously. And it's, other than the example in the Confessions that he, steals pears, right, as a teenager, right? That is the only real instance of like a transgression that we have. Sometimes people make the argument about how he had you know, what we would today call a common law marriage, right? He lived with somebody, they had a son together, right? But
it was only common law because his family, particularly his father, wanted him to have him be available to marry another Roman citizen
right,
for political advancement purposes. This wasn't like him, keeping like a side piece. This was someone, the only committed relationship, only sexual relationship we know of, committed, monogamous, a child. Yeah, he wasn't running around and chasing after girls on the beaches of Hippo.
exactly. So I think, again, his Balthasar's phrase, they're questing, like that is the way to think of Augustine, right? Here's somebody who, is interested in ideas, right? He loves ideas. He obviously in the Confessions, he critiques himself in that he was lusting after power and influence, right? He wanted to be a great rhetorician in the Roman Empire, and he did achieve some of that. He did achieve some recognition for that. But that's not out of the ordinary. That's human nature, right? Like, so. But again, his kind of this pull of his mind, right? He's looking for something that is sort of this, all-encompassing truth, right? He's a seeker of truth. He's a seeker of ideas, and I think Balthasar again does a great job of presenting that in this section.
There was, in the first book, there was a kind of a tick of Balthasar, as we talked about, where he would talk at length about these ideas of the philosophers he was dealing with without ever kind of coming down and saying, and I agree with this.
Right.
And he does a bit of that here. And just from sort of what I know and understand of Augustine, I do feel he is, I don't want to say picking and choosing, but he's certainly presenting aspects of it, that generally support his point of view.
Sure, yeah.
I think we saw more clearly before in Irenaeus. But, here, there's a great little dialogue in the first full paragraph of 99 about light and the visual power of the soul, and all these other things that definitely seem to support his idea of this aesthetic perception, is sort of like aesthetic epistemology being key. But of course, he's presenting this is what Augustine said, and not what I say, I, Balthasar, say.
Right.
And I still kind of wish of saying, and I agree with this. I think this is right. And maybe this is interesting, or having the philosophy or the theology and the theologian speaking, where you're presenting doctrine or talking about doctrine. So there's a little less of like, I think that X, Y, and Z versus there is official dogma and official teachings. And so he's kind of not using some of the language I might like. I wonder if that is kind of the theologian speaking, that I am explicating
Right.
accepted things.
One thing that I thought was interesting, from, if we look at 101, again, this is what made me want to read The True Religion, De Vera Religione. Again, like this is one of these areas where I think when you read a magisterial thinker like Balthasar, it's a humbling experience, because you realize how little you know, right? I didn't know in that text Augustine made arguments that he says all religions outside of the church are syncretic at best. So what does that say? It says that every tradition that is sort of developed in human existence has aspects of the truth, right? Which is what we would say today, right? But that was very interesting to see that. So again, maybe you want to say how does Augustine approach these, the questions of traditions outside of the church? Because my only experience of that was in the City of God, but that was obviously Augustine's full rhetorical power, right? He's sort of mocking the Roman traditions a bit. But I think that was in part a response to what people were saying, right? Where they said Christianity killed the Roman Empire. And he's like, well, if your gods were real, how come you lost all these battles, right? So,
And of course, these days I tend to go with Gibbon in this sense, not his anti-Christianity, but Rome didn't fall in the 5th century. Rome fell in the 15th century. That the Byzantines called themselves Roman.
right, exactly.
They were the Romani, and the capital Rome had been the capital for actually quite some time. It moved to Ravenna, I think even Milan for a while. So Rome was an idea. And of course, thinking of that, it's apropos of nothing, but on that page 101, this basic theme of all philosophy, in particular of all Eastern philosophy, and the Egyptian Plotinus also belongs to the East. Or a reminder that Augustine is not a Western thinker. He is not, not that he didn't read, the works of Greece and Rome, of course, Greece also being east of Italy. The reminder of Christianity was originally, from the point of view of most of the Roman Empire, it was an Eastern cult.
Right.
And sort of,
an Eastern cult that was potentially dangerous too.
mystifying and making strange again. I think it's important to regain that strangeness, that there is that this is sui generis.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
I do want to again, so looking through the things I highlighted, looking back at 99, here where theory and ethics converge, there emerges as a third term, almost as a product. Aesthetics, the ability to see. Because aesthetics for him is an epistemological term, essentially. That's been the way throughout. It was less clear in the first one, though I'm appreciating book one more now reading this. I am more and more seeing the foundations he laid, and that he did. And the introduction of this one is like he says to us, like, I'm not sure you quite proved what you said, but it laid it was less of proving, as he says in the very beginning, like, I have shown X, Y, and Z. Like, I'm not sure you did show that, but it's more like, you've taken algebra 1. Now we're doing algebra 2 and building upon that. So,
yeah, no, I had the same thought, particularly toward the end when he reflects on the question of, is Christ beautiful, right? Because the book one ends with that, on this reflection of because the title obviously is seeing the form, like what is the form, right? Jesus is the perfection of the form, like Jesus who is God, right? So then it begins, he brings us back to that, whether, because it's on a few different pages. It's like, yeah, I think it's like pages like 134 to 138, I think, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I mean, so when I read that, I said, okay, here it is, linking more of his ideas from the previous. And again, I think we probably have to think of this as one book, right? In some ways, like the you know, the Lord of the Rings is one book, even though it's marketed as three, right? It's not three books, it's one. I mean,
No,
it's right, like it's books in the sense of like book one, part one, but like it's not.
yeah,
It's yeah, it's a singular
not that you
thing, not
can't divide it up, but it is also a whole.
right,
Yeah, maybe like or like the Divine Comedy.
right,
It is Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, but nonetheless, it's not like you need them all.
right,
But yeah, actually, I was looking at though page 134. Uh, that you're talking about, the culmination of this equation of number and light, however, is a mystery of the transcendent Trinity, which we won't go on from there. It talks about the light, which is the clear obsession for Balthasar, as well as his connection to sight. But I kind of highlighted, well, partly I wrote above there my notes of like, I don't know enough Augustine to understand the whole number thing. And I stick with that. But part of what I thought with number was the idea of the form that he gave, which had number is not exactly spatial. It's not exactly, embodied or, but perhaps that idea I thought more of extension of being part of the number does imply a certain groundedness. Uh, it's a measurement of space, of time, without itself necessarily being limited to that.
right,
And so I can kind of see that of his idea of form. So you have his idea of form and then light, which more and more I think does represent gnosis, does represent his aesthetics really is light, is, being light and vision, that the light's what makes vision possible, and the vision is what creates this aesthetic knowledge. Uh, that's key to him. And, I don't know how much he is sort of like, is he leaving out the part of Saint Augustine where he says, and this other thing is all complete garbage, right? And
right.
I'm sure that somewhere in, on the Trinity or the true religion, he's got something in there which totally refutes everything Balthasar has ever said.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that I think is interesting. This is not something that Balthasar addresses, I think, but this is something I remember from my studies, college, and just conversations I had with the Assumptionists. Um, so unless I'm totally wrong here, misremembering, I think Augustine really gets any Plato he knows through Plotinus. I'm not sure if he ever actually read Plato himself, because I know that even for like Aristotle, Augustine only has the categories. He did not read or was familiar with anything else. So,
And Balthasar does not attribute because that to Augustine too. He's constantly referencing Plotinus, and when Plato comes up, it's in Platonic ideas versus
right,
like obviously referencing this from the Phaedo. He definitely doesn't do that. He's
right,
you're right. It is immediate. It is Platonic or
right,
Neoplatonic rather than Plato himself. And page 106, they got the chapter within the chapter, true and good. And I just I wrote in there, and the beautiful. But of course, the very next section, I believe, is called the beautiful,
yep,
section 3. So I like that little bit of wit there. But at the beginning of that, the distinctive Augustinian stamp is in his anti-skeptical search for the true starting point of intellectual reflection. And finding secure, the fundamental task of ratio, reason, is to find secure foundations for truth in the original pure act of cogito, understanding knowledge. Uh, but that even though he's using, you know, these days we hear cogito, at least from me, I hear cogito, I think cogito ergo sum.
exactly,
But
yep,
he is this completely opposite. The real starting point is not from I know nothing, because the real starting point has to be anti-skeptical.
Right.
More of who was it? That's been badly translated as, I believe, because it is absurd. Is that Tertullian? One
No,
of
I don't
those.
remember.
I know it's a mistranslation
Yeah.
of what he actually said, but just sort of that the beginning is not understanding. The beginning is uh, a considered acceptance that then leads to understanding. You take that first step, and then you can understand. Uh, but just that, very much that anti-Cartesian, which I bring up in part because I did see Cartesian extension, Cartesian geometry, as being relevant to his idea of the form in book one, which comes up a lot less here. Probably because he's dealing with someone who is Platonic. And
Right.
so early on, there's some talk of form. Can I pause you for a second?
No, sure.